They said humans were soft, predictable, that our species had grown weak behind our technological shields, that we'd forgotten the primal instincts that had clawed us up from the dirt of a death world called Earth. The Galactic Council's most elite believed this. Especially Zyxtar Velkoroth, heir to the richest mining consortium in 3 sectors. When he landed on the frontier station of New Cheyenne in his platinum-hulled yacht, dripping with more credits than most worlds saw in a year, he expected the same deference he received everywhere else in the galaxy. He didn't expect to meet Dr. Sarah Chen. What started as a casual insult about primitive human endurance became a wager that would shake the foundations of everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. 1 month. 1 challenge. 1 human woman against the most advanced alien technology money could buy. But Sarah Chen carried something in her blood that no amount of wealth could purchase. Something that had driven her ancestors across oceans in wooden ships, across continents in covered wagons, and now across the void between stars. Zyxtar was about to learn why they called humans the descendants of cowboys. And why you should never, ever bet against one. The platinum hull of Zyxtar Velkoroth's personal yacht gleamed like a second sun as it descended through the atmosphere of Kepler 442b. The ship was a masterpiece of Velthari engineering, each curve and angle designed not just for function but to announce the immense wealth of its owner. As it settled onto the landing pad of New Cheyenne Station with barely a whisper, locals stopped their work to stare. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't one of them. She stood knee-deep in the red mud of Irrigation Channel 7, her weather-beaten hat pulled low against the alien sun, completely absorbed in calibrating the atmospheric processors that kept this frontier colony alive. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency across the control interface, adjusting chemical balances that would determine whether the next harvest could feed 3,000 souls or leave them dependent on expensive supply runs from the core worlds. "Ma'am," called Tom Bradley, one of the younger colonists. His voice carried that particular mix of excitement and nervousness that came with unexpected visitors. "That fancy ship that just landed? Word is it belongs to some big-shot alien millionaire." Sarah didn't look up from her readings. The processor's output had been fluctuating for weeks, and she was finally getting somewhere with the calibration. "That's nice, Tom. Hand me that hydrospanner, would you? He's asking about you specifically." That made her pause. Sarah straightened slowly, her joints protesting after 4 hours in the irrigation ditch. At 42, she'd spent the last 15 years on frontier worlds, and every one of those years showed in her weathered face and calloused hands. "Asking about me? What for?" "Don't know, ma'am. But Sheriff Martinez is heading this way with the whole delegation." Sarah sighed and climbed out of the channel, accepting Tom's offered hand. The red mud clung to her boots like clay, and her work clothes had seen better decades. She wasn't exactly dressed to meet galactic royalty, but then, again, she'd never much cared about appearances. The delegation approached across the dusty expanse of the agricultural sector. Sheriff Martinez led the way, his weathered face grim with the expression of a man who'd dealt with too many complications in his 60-year life. Behind him walked 3 figures that definitely weren't from around these parts. The first was clearly the money. Zyxtar Velkoroth stood nearly 8 feet tall, his scaled hide shimmering with an iridescent quality that suggested genetic modification rather than natural evolution. His clothing was cut from materials that probably cost more than Sarah's annual salary, and the confidence in his stride spoke of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. The second figure was his translator, a nervous-looking Andraxian whose 4 arms gestured constantly as it spoke into a small device. The third was obviously muscle, a hulking Carillion mercenary whose scarred hide and cold eyes suggested it had seen action on a dozen worlds. They stopped 20 feet away, Zyxtar's vertical pupil studying Sarah with the same interest she might show a particularly stubborn piece of machinery. "Dr. Chen," Sheriff Martinez called out, "this is Zyxtar Velkoroth. He owns the Velkoroth Mining Consortium. Apparently, he's heard about our little setup here and wanted to talk to you about it." Sarah wiped her hands on her coveralls and nodded politely. "Mr. Velkoroth, welcome to New Cheyenne. I hope you're enjoying your visit." The translator's device chattered for a moment before producing a smooth, cultured voice in perfect standard. He says to tell you that he finds your operation here quaint. He wishes to know how long you expect this settlement to survive without proper corporate backing. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. In her experience, when rich folks started asking pointed questions about survival, it usually meant they were planning to make survival more difficult. We've been here 8 years now. Built everything you see from scratch. I'd say we're doing just fine. More chittering from the translator. He says that's impressive for such a primitive approach. He wonders if you truly believe human endurance is sufficient to sustain a colony in such a harsh environment. The word primitive hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being underestimated. Around her, the other colonists had begun to gather, their faces showing the same mix of offense and determination that had driven humanity to spread across half the galaxy despite being relative newcomers to the galactic stage. Primitive? Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously calm. Mr. Velkoroth, with all due respect, my people terraformed 12 worlds before your species figured out how to build a space elevator. We've got colonies thriving in places that would kill most aliens in minutes. You want to talk about endurance? We're standing on it. The translator worked overtime, ZYX-Star's head tilting as he listened. His response, when it came, carried the unmistakable tone of aristocratic amusement. He says that was in the past. Modern humans have grown soft behind their technology. He doubts any human could survive what his people consider a basic endurance trial. He finds it amusing that you believe otherwise. Sarah looked around at her fellow colonists. Tom Bradley, whose grandfather had walked across half of North America during the Great Migration. Maria Santos, whose family had survived the Martian dust storms of 2287. Jake Morrison, who'd personally built 17 atmospheric processors on worlds where the air would dissolve human lungs in minutes. These weren't soft people. They were descendants of cowboys and pioneers, engineers and explorers who'd looked at the vast emptiness of space and said, yes, we'll take that too. You know what? Sarah said, pulling off her work gloves. I think Mr. Velkoroth might be right. The gathered colonists stared at her in shock. Sheriff Martinez's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Modern humans probably are getting soft, she continued conversationally. Living on those nice core worlds with their climate control and their automated everything. But, see, we're not core world humans. We're frontier stock. Different breed entirely. She stepped closer to the alien delegation, close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet ZYX-Star's gaze. So here's what I'm thinking. If Mr. Velkoroth is so confident about human limitations, maybe he'd be interested in a little wager. Test out his theory, so to speak. The translator's devices buzzed with what sounded like excitement. ZYX-Star's response came back immediately. He is intrigued. What sort of wager do you propose? Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a particularly nice smile. Simple endurance test. Him against me. 1 month, survival conditions, no technology beyond basic safety gear. Winner takes whatever stakes we agree on. And, if you lose? If I lose, we'll consider selling New Cheyenne to his consortium. Let him turn our little colony into another corporate mining operation. The crowd of colonists erupted in protests, but Sarah held up a hand. And, if I win, Mr. Velkoroth makes a public statement acknowledging human endurance capabilities and agrees to leave us alone. Permanently. More chittering from the translator, then, a sound that might have been laughter from ZYX-Star himself. He says you are either very brave or very foolish. He agrees to your terms, but wishes to add something to the stakes. If he wins, in addition to purchasing rights to your colony, you will work for his consortium as a, what is the human term, poster child for human inferiority. A living example of why humans need corporate protection to survive. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, but her voice remained steady. And, if I win? If you win, he will not only leave your colony alone but will publicly fund 3 new human frontier settlements of your choosing. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. 3 new colonies. 3 chances for thousands of people to build new lives on the frontier. 3 proof-of-concept settlements that would show the galaxy what humans could accomplish without corporate oversight. Deal, Sarah said without hesitation. They shook hands, human flesh meeting scale alien hide, while the translator worked to establish the formal parameters of their agreement. 1 month from today, they would be transported to a neutral world chosen by the Galactic Arbitration Council. Basic survival gear only. No outside assistance. Last person standing wins. As the delegation walked away, Sheriff Martinez grabbed Sarah's arm. Sarah, what the hell are you thinking? You just bet our entire colony on a damned endurance contest. She watched ZYX-Star's retreating figure, noting the casual arrogance in every step. Jim, that alien just called humanity soft. He thinks we're broken down pets who can't survive without corporate masters. So he's about to learn something that every good cowboy knows. She turned to face the assembled colonists, her eyes bright with determination. It ain't the size of the horse that matters. It's the size of the fight in the horse. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his young face serious. What do you need from us, Doc? Start spreading the word to the other frontier colonies. In 1 month, we're going to show the galaxy what human endurance really looks like. She looked back toward the landing pad, where ZYX-Star's yacht gleamed in the afternoon sun. And we're going to make damn sure everyone's watching when we do it. As the sun set over New Cheyenne Station, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Sarah of home, she felt the familiar surge of stubborn determination that had carried her ancestors across impossible distances. ZYX-Star might have wealth and technology and alien superiority on his side. But Sarah Chen had something better. She had 15 generations of ornery human stubbornness in her blood, and she'd be damned if she was going to let some fancy alien make her people look weak. The cowboy was about to get his shock, all right. Just not the kind he was expecting. The neutral world of Kethara stretched endlessly in every direction, a monument to nature's casual cruelty. When the Galactic Arbitration Council had selected it as the testing ground, they'd chosen well. The planet was technically habitable for both human and Velthari physiology, but barely. Days lasted 36 standard hours with surface temperatures that swung from freezing at dawn to desert hot by afternoon. The atmosphere was thin enough to make every breath a conscious effort, and the wildlife had evolved with the singular purpose of making life difficult for anything that didn't belong. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the designated starting zone, testing the weight of her basic survival pack. The Arbitration Council had been ruthlessly fair in their equipment allocation. Each contestant received identical gear, a basic shelter, water purification tablets, emergency rations for 3 days, a single cutting tool, and a distress beacon that would end the challenge the moment it was activated. Everything else they'd have to provide for themselves. Nervous, human? Sarah turned to find ZYX-Star Velkoroth approaching, his scaled hide already shimmering with what she now recognized as the Velthari equivalent of perspiration. Despite his obvious discomfort in the alien environment, his translator device rendered his voice with the same aristocratic confidence she'd heard on New Cheyenne. About as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, she replied, adjusting the straps on her pack. You? The translator buzzed with confusion for a moment before settling on a response. He says your metaphor translates poorly but assumes you mean you are confident. He finds this amusing. Sarah studied her opponent more carefully. ZYX-Star stood nearly 8 feet tall and probably weighed twice what she did. His scales were designed to regulate temperature in extreme environments, and his species had evolved on a world with slightly thinner atmosphere than this one. By any reasonable measure, he should have had a significant advantage. But Sarah had learned long ago that reasonable measures didn't account for human stubbornness. Tell me something, she said conversationally. How much of your life have you spent actually roughing it? I mean, outside of climate-controlled environments? More chittering from the translator. He says he has completed the traditional survival trials of his people. 14 standard days in the crystalline wastes of his home world. 14 days, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. That's not bad. Climate-controlled backup available? Only in the event of life-threatening emergency. Sarah nodded approvingly. Sounds like your people take survival training seriously. That's good. Wouldn't want this to be too easy. For the first time since their meeting, ZYXstar's translator remains silent for several seconds before producing a response. He wishes to know if you are attempting to intimidate him. Nope, Sarah said cheerfully. Just making conversation. Where I come from, we like to know who we're dealing with. The Arbitration Council's representative, a crystalline entity whose voice resonated like wind chimes, announced the beginning of the trial. Both contestants were transported to opposite sides of a marked territory roughly 50 kilometers square. The rules were simple: survive for 30 standard days, and victory went to whoever remained functional and alert at the end. Sarah found herself deposited in a rocky valley dotted with twisted trees that looked like something out of a fever dream. The first thing she did was taste the air, noting the sharp mineral tang that suggested volcanic activity somewhere nearby. The second thing she did was find water. Her grandmother had taught her that water was everything. You can live 30 days without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air, the old woman had said. Always secure your water first. Sarah followed that advice religiously. By the end of the first day, she'd located a small spring feeding into a natural basin, tested the water for basic toxicity, and set up her shelter in a protected alcove that would shield her from the worst of the temperature swings. She rationed her emergency food carefully, knowing that 3 days of rations were meant to buy her time to find local food sources, not sustain her for a month. The second day brought her first real challenge. The local wildlife had apparently decided that she was either prey or competition for resources. The creatures looked like a cross between earth ravens and flying lizards, with metallic beaks that could probably punch through human skin without much effort. Sarah watched them circle overhead for most of the morning, then carefully collected a pile of the sharpest rocks she could find. When the first one dove at her, she was ready. The rock caught it square in the chest, sending it tumbling to the ground with a very satisfying thud. The others got the message and found somewhere else to hunt. By the end of the first week, Sarah had established what her grandfather would have called a proper camp. She'd expanded her shelter using fallen timber and stones, created a reliable water collection system that filtered runoff from the occasional rains, and identified 3 different types of edible plants growing in the valley. She'd also fashioned a decent spear from a straight branch and her cutting tool, turning it into both a walking stick and a weapon. More importantly, she'd started mapping the territory. Every day, she ventured a little further from her base camp, carefully noting landmarks, water sources, and potential hazards. The knowledge was building up in her head like a 3-dimensional map, the kind of deep territorial awareness that had kept her ancestors alive in environments that changed with every season. On day 9, she encountered ZYXstar for the first time since the trial began. He was crossing the same ridge she'd been scouting, moving carefully but steadily toward what she recognized as one of the better water sources in the area. His equipment looked intact, and his movements suggested he was still in good condition, but something about his posture worried her. Sarah could have avoided him entirely, but her upbringing wouldn't let her. When someone might be in trouble, you checked on them. It was basic human decency, competition or no competition. After noon, she called out as she approached his position. ZYXstar's translator crackled to life. He says he is surprised to encounter you. He asks if you are surrendering. Just being neighborly, Sarah replied. You doing all right? You look a little peaked. He says he is functioning within acceptable parameters. Sarah studied him more carefully. ZYXstar's scales had lost some of their lustrous quality, and there was a slight tremor in his hands that suggested either fatigue or nutritional deficiency. His pack looked lighter than it should have after only 9 days. Food situation working out okay? She asked casually. The pause before the translation came back was telling. He says his nutritional requirements are being met. Sarah nodded slowly. In her experience, people who were eating well didn't talk about their nutritional requirements being met. They said they were fine, or well-fed, or even just okay. Formal language was usually a polite way of admitting things weren't great. Water sources treating you well? Adequate. Another diplomatic non-answer. Sarah made a decision that probably went against every bit of strategic thinking she'd ever learned. Look, I know we're competing and all, but there's a really good spring about 2 clicks south of here. Better flow than most of the others in the area, and it's got natural filtration through a rock bed. If you're having trouble with your current source, might be worth checking out. ZYX went very still. His translator remains silent for nearly a full minute before crackling back to life. He asks why you would provide him with strategically valuable information. Sarah shrugged. Where I come from, we don't let people die of thirst, even if we don't much like them. Besides, wouldn't be much of a victory if you keeled over from bad water. I want to beat you fair and square. She started to walk away, then paused. Oh, and those purple berries growing on the low bushes? Don't eat them. They'll give you a gut ache that'll last 3 days. She left ZYX standing on the ridge, his translator chattering frantically as he processed what had just happened. The next few days brought new challenges. The weather turned vicious, with storms that dropped the temperature by 40 degrees and brought winds that could knock a person off their feet. Sarah rode it out in her expanded shelter, using techniques her great-grandfather had taught her about building with local materials. The key was flexibility. Let the wind and rain do their work, and build something that bent instead of breaking. On day 15, exactly halfway through the trial, she encountered evidence that ZYX was struggling more than he'd let on. She found his discarded emergency rations package near a water source she'd told him about, and the fact that he'd already consumed food meant to last 3 days suggested he was having trouble finding local alternatives. Sarah felt a familiar pang of concern. Competition was one thing, but she'd grown up with stories of frontier folk who died because they were too proud to ask for help or too stubborn to accept it when it was offered. She started leaving things. Nothing obvious. A few particularly good routes in places where ZYX might find them. Edible bark stripped from trees along his apparent routes. A fish trap positioned where he'd be likely to spot it if he was paying attention. She told herself it was just basic human decency. But, deep down, she knew it was more than that. ZYX had challenged her people's capabilities, but he'd done it honestly and with genuine belief in his position. He wasn't trying to cheat or take unfair advantage. He was just wrong about what humans could endure. Proving him wrong was one thing. Letting him suffer while she did it was another entirely. By day 20, Sarah had turned her valley into something approaching a homestead. She'd built a proper cabin using fallen timber and stone, established multiple water sources with basic filtration systems, and created a reliable food production system based on local plants and the occasional fish from the streams. Her body had adapted to the thin air and temperature extremes, and she felt stronger than she had at the beginning of the trial. She was actually starting to enjoy herself. On day 23, she found ZYX collapsed near one of the water sources she'd recommended. He was conscious but barely, his scales dull and his breathing labored. His pack was nearly empty, and his translator had apparently given up entirely. No amount of coaxing could get it to produce more than static. Sarah didn't hesitate. She hauled him back to his feet, got her shoulder under his arm, and half-carried him to her camp. It took the better part of 4 hours, and, by the time they arrived, both of them were exhausted. "You're an idiot," she told him as she got him settled in her shelter. "And I'm an idiot for helping you. But damned if I'm going to let you die on my watch." ZYX response was a weak chirping sound that her translator couldn't process, but the tone was unmistakably grateful. She spent the next 2 days nursing him back to functional health, sharing her food and water while explaining the basics of survival in their current environment. Slowly, his translator began working again, and she could see his natural pride warring with genuine respect. On day 26, with only 4 days left in the trial, ZYX asked the question she'd been expecting. "He wants to know why you saved him." Sarah looked up from the fish she was preparing for their dinner. "Because that's what people do. We help each other. Even when helping means you might lose the wager?" "Especially then," Sarah replied firmly. "Winning isn't worth much if you have to stop being human to do it." The translator was quiet for a long moment. When ZYXstar's voice came through again, it carried a different tone entirely. He says he believes he understands now why humans have spread so far across the galaxy despite their apparent limitations. Sarah smiled and handed him a portion of the cooked fish. What's that? You are not trying to survive. You are trying to live. There is a difference. For the first time since meeting him, Sarah found herself actually liking ZYXstar Velkoroth. He was still arrogant and entitled, but he was also capable of learning. That was more than she could say for a lot of folks, alien or human. With 4 days left in the trial, they had reached an understanding that would change everything. Day 27 dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made even an alien sky look like home. Sarah Chin woke to find ZYXstar already stirring the breakfast fire, his movements careful but steady. His recovery over the past 3 days had been remarkable, though she suspected his pride was healing more slowly than his body. Morning, she called out, stretching muscles that had grown accustomed to the planet's lighter gravity. How are you feeling? His translator crackled to life. He says he is adequate. He also wishes to discuss the parameters of your wager. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What about them? He believes the trial has become invalid. She sat up straighter, suddenly, alert. How so? Because you saved his life, he believes the original conditions have been altered. He cannot claim victory knowing that he would have died without your intervention. Sarah studied her unlikely companion's scale features, noting the way his secondary eyelids fluttered when he was uncomfortable. And he proposes to activate his emergency beacon. To formally surrender. Like hell. The vehemence in her voice startled both of them. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of their shared camp. ZYXstar, listen to me carefully. I didn't save your life so you could quit. I saved it because that's what humans do. Period. End of discussion. More chittering from the translator. He says he cannot accept victory under these circumstances. And, I can't accept you surrendering because you got some help when you needed it. Sarah turned back to face him, her expression fierce. You think survival is supposed to be a solo act? You think humans conquered half the galaxy by going it alone? She gestured at their camp, at the improvements they'd made over the past few days working together. This right here? This is how humans survive. We help each other. We share resources. We build communities wherever we land, because that's what we are, community builders. But, the wager specified individual endurance. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Son, you've been misunderstanding human endurance from the very beginning. You think it's about one person toughing it out against impossible odds. That's not endurance, that's just stubbornness. Human endurance is about building something that lasts. About creating systems and relationships and communities that can weather any storm. She knelt by the fire, adding another piece of carefully prepared wood. My great-great-grandmother walked across half of North America during the Great Migration. You know how she survived? Not by being the strongest or the toughest, but by helping everyone else survive too. She shared water when people were dying of thirst. She delivered babies in the middle of blizzards. She taught people how to find food when the supply wagons didn't come. He asks how this relates to your current situation. Because I'm still doing exactly what she did. I'm surviving by making sure everyone around me survives too. That's not cheating, that's the whole damn point. ZYXstar went very still. His translator remained silent for several minutes, and Sarah could almost see him processing concepts that didn't fit into his worldview. He says his people view survival as an individual accomplishment. And, how's that working out for them? Another long pause. He admits that Veltheri expansion has been limited compared to human expansion. Aha! Sarah settled back down by the fire, her tone gentling slightly. Look, I'm not saying individual toughness doesn't matter. Hell, it matters a lot. But, it's not the whole story. The reason humans have colonies in places that should kill us is because we figured out that survival is a team sport. She looked directly at him, her weathered face serious. The past 3 days? Us working together? This is human endurance. This is what it actually looks like. But, if he cannot claim individual victory, then, maybe you need to think about what victory actually means. That afternoon, they received an unexpected visitor. The Arbitration Council's representative materialized in their camp with the same crystal and chime that had marked the beginning of the trial. Both contestants looked up from their respective tasks. Sarah had been weaving a water-carrying basket from local fibers, while ZYXstar had been attempting to improve their fish trap design. "I am here to conduct the mid-trial assessment," the entity announced, its voice like wine through crystal formations. Both contestants appear to be functional and alert. "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. The monitoring devices indicate that one contestant experienced significant physiological distress between days 20 and 23. ZYXstar's translator activated. He acknowledges this is accurate. The same monitoring devices indicate that the other contestant provided direct assistance during this period. "Also accurate," Sarah said evenly. The crystalline entity rotated slightly, its faceted surface catching the alien sunlight. The Arbitration Council has received communications from interested parties requesting clarification of the trial parameters under these circumstances. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of interested parties? Representatives of 67 human frontier colonies. 14 alien corporate entities. The Galactic Colonial Assessment Board. And approximately 400,000 individual subscribers to the Galactic Sports Network. She stared at the entity. Subscribers? This trial has become the most watched survival challenge in galactic history. Current viewership exceeds previous records by a factor of 12. ZYXstar made a sound that his translator rendered as surprised choking. The interested parties wish to know if the assistance provided constitutes a violation of the trial parameters. Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing. 400,000 people were watching this. 67 human colonies had weighed in. This wasn't just about her bet with an arrogant alien anymore, it had become something much larger. "Tell them this," she said carefully. The trial parameters specified survival for 30 days. They didn't specify individual survival. They didn't prohibit cooperation. They didn't ban community building or mutual assistance. The entity's surface sparkled as it processed this information. The linguistic analysis of the original agreement supports this interpretation. Then, there's no violation. The Arbitration Council concurs. However, they have received a formal request from one of the contestants to modify the trial parameters. Sarah looked at ZYXstar, whose secondary eyelids were fluttering rapidly. What kind of modification? He wishes to change the victory conditions. More chittering from the translator. When it spoke, ZYXstar's voice carried a formality that hadn't been there before. He proposes that victory should not be determined by individual endurance, but by the ability to establish a sustainable survival situation that could support additional colonists. Sarah blinked. Come again? He suggests that the true test of survival capability is not merely staying alive, but creating conditions where others could thrive. He proposes that victory should go to whoever has built the more robust foundation for long-term habitation. The Arbitration Council entity rotated thoughtfully. This would require assessment of infrastructure, resource sustainability, defensive capabilities, and expansion potential. He agrees to these parameters. Sarah looked around their camp, her camp, really, though ZYXstar had contributed to improvements over the past few days. She'd built a solid shelter, established multiple water sources, developed sustainable food production, and created tools that could be replicated by future colonists. More importantly, she'd proven that cooperation and community building were force multipliers for human survival. I accept the modified parameters, she said. Then, the assessment will be conducted over the remaining 3 days of the trial. As the entity dissolved back into whatever dimension it had come from, Sarah turned to stare at ZYX star. "Why?" she asked simply. His translator was quiet for a moment before responding. "Because you taught him that survival is not about enduring hardship. It is about building something that transcends hardship." The final 3 days passed in a blur of activity. The Arbitration Council's assessment team, a collection of experts from a dozen species, cataloged every aspect of their survival setup. They measured water flow rates, tested food production sustainability, evaluated shelter integrity against weather patterns, and even ran stress tests on their tool-making capabilities. More importantly, they documented the community infrastructure Sarah had built. The knowledge transfer systems she'd developed to share survival techniques. The resource-sharing protocols that could support additional colonists. The cooperative frameworks that turned individual survival into collective thriving. On the final day, as they prepared for extraction, ZYX-Star asked one last question. "He wishes to know what you will do with your victory." Sarah looked out across the valley they'd called home for 30 days. Despite its harsh conditions, despite the challenges and near disasters, she found herself feeling oddly fond of the place. It had tested her, but it had also reminded her of why she loved the frontier. "First, I'm going to hold you to the original terms. 3 new human colonies, funded by your consortium. He agrees to this. Second, I'm going to make you a counteroffer." The translator buzzed with curiosity. "He is listening. Your people are good at individual survival, but you're missing the point of what survival is for. I propose a joint venture. Human community building expertise combined with Valtheri resource management and technology. We build colonies together, places where both our species can thrive." ZYX Star went very still. "You would trust his people as partners?" "I'd trust you as a partner," Sarah corrected. "You've learned what cooperation means. You've seen how community makes everyone stronger. The question is whether you think your people can learn the same thing." The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "He says he believes they can. He would be honored to try." When the extraction ships arrived, they found 2 contestants who had become collaborators, competitors who had become partners, and a demonstration that had become the foundation for a new model of galactic expansion. The wealthy cowboy had indeed received his shock, just as Sarah had predicted. But so had she. Because sometimes the best victories weren't about proving others wrong, they were about proving that everyone could be right, working together. As their ship lifted off from Kethera's surface, Sarah looked down at the valley where they'd learned to trust each other. In 6 months, it would host the first joint human-Valtheri colonial settlement. In a year, it would be a model for cross-species cooperation across 3 sectors. And it all started with a cowboy who thought she was soft, and a frontier woman who proved that the strongest thing in the universe wasn't individual toughness. It was the simple human insistence that nobody had to survive alone.